Gluttony hides in your drinking because gluttony is not just about eating. The Bible speaks frequently about drinking alcohol, and it doesn't talk about it all the time in a negative way. Jesus turns water into wine, right? The wedding at Cana, his very first miracle. Jesus turns water into wine. Many of us, though, are actually frequent gluttons in the form of drinking too much. Proverbs 23, it says this, be not among the drunkards or among the gluttonous eaters of meat. For the drunkard and the glutton will come to poverty, and slumber will clothe them with rags. Gluttony and alcoholism, drunkards, as the Bible would say. When we think about, I should say, most of us, when we think about drunkards, we think about like a cartoon that's like hiccuping, like Barney from The Simpsons, or some weird cartoon in Looney Tunes, or the Bugs Bunny cartoons where they're like hiccuping and they're alcoholic. They sing like those pink elephants. You can be a glutton with a craft brew hobby. You can be a glutton who loves to go to wineries often and has a winery membership and a wine. What are those things called in the basement? The wine cellars. You can be a glutton of alcohol or an alcoholic with a wine cellar. It's not just always a hobby. Sometimes you're an alcoholic. Anyway, the point is that these two concepts are often looped together, right? The gluttony and alcoholism, or the drunkard. They're often linked together. Turns out we're really predisposed to them, and both often lead us away from full dependency on Jesus, and that's the point. So we turn to the pleasures of the world to bring comfort and healing to ourselves. I'm sure you're well aware of the addictive nature of alcohol and its dangers. So I'm not going to belabor that. I think there's probably an episode for us to talk about alcohol specifically. Some Christians believe you shouldn't drink alcohol at all. Some believe you're able to partake of it. No Christians believe you should be able to drink as much as you can, but you often do see Christians do that. Pastors are often guilty of drinking too much, especially around other pastors because they have an opportunity to do so. And sometimes pastors find themselves as alcoholics. And it's sad to say, it's not an accusational thing, but I will say you have to be careful as a ministry leader not to drink too much. One of the issues is that the amount people drink is really going up. We're actually culturally drinking far more than people did in Jesus' day. And there's a few studies to show why that's true. Now, there's some disagreement on whether or not what I'm about to say next is true. But from the studies I've looked at, wine was fermented and consumed at far lower percentages than the percentages of alcohol we see in, let's say, our Bevmos today. We see alcohol in the 1% to 4% range. Sometimes they would get up a little higher. But the idea that we'd have 14% wine alcohol content was almost unheard of. Now, I've seen it later, some studies come out later that's produced at higher content. But the point is, we have 24/7 access to alcohol. You can go to a 7-Eleven in the middle of the night and get it, okay? You can brew your own alcohol. You can make your own moonshine in the past, and you could ferment your own wine. But it almost always was not as available as it is today. You can't go get a malt liquor in the first century from the corner store at 2 a.m. You can today. It's an addictive, slippery slope. Ephesians 5:18, friends. Do not become drunk with wine, but be filled with the Holy Spirit. What does that mean? It means it's impossible to be drunk and also be currently led by God. It's impossible to worship God overly, over the top, and repeatedly be a glutton and a drunkard. The moment you are being led by alcohol, you can no longer be led by God at the same time. Ephesians 5:18, do not become drunk with wine, but be filled with the Holy Spirit. Now, if you're a Christian, I don't know what your soteriology is, that's your salvation, or like how you understand salvation theologically. I'm not going to say God's going to leave you if you're an alcoholic, but what I will say is that the Holy Spirit is not leading you if you're hammered. Now, the biggest comeback is, well, I've shared the gospel when I'm drunk. You can share the gospel on cocaine. That doesn't mean you should do it. You can share the gospel at a strip club. It doesn't mean you should go there. And guess what? God can save the stripper in the strip club if you use the gospel. It doesn't mean it was a good idea to go there. So just because you get drunk and share the gospel does not mean you should be drunk. Well, it lowered my courage so I could share the gospel. And there's plenty of people that don't know Jesus at the strip club. It doesn't mean you should go. God can justify the ends and the means. It doesn't mean you should use the negative thing. It's a really bad idea to try to use that logic. It's really quite silly. You could be high on heroin or fentanyl and share the gospel. It doesn't mean you should do it, right? Bad idea. Whether you eat or whether you drink, do all to the glory of God. Are you doing that when you drink? Let's keep going. Where else does gluttony hide? Funny enough, it hides in the waistline, because gluttony is not merely evidenced by what you look like. You can look differently as a glutton. Gluttony can look differently on some people. Some people can eat one Skittle and they gain 20 pounds. Of course, I'm being pejorative. That's kind of like that's my story. And some people can eat 50 tacos in one sitting and look like Kate Moss on a juice fast. Okay? That's not the point. Studies show that the risk of heart disease was nearly the same regardless of weight and appearance if the diet was poor. So you could be skinny and be genetically predisposed to having visceral fat around the organs that's not subcutaneous, which subcutaneous fat is fat that sits underneath the skin that looks more what you would think a fat person looks like or an overweight person looks like. It doesn't mean that you are less likely to have a heart attack. It doesn't mean you're less likely to be diabetic. It doesn't mean you're less likely to have a chronic disease. You can still be unhealthy. In fact, it's almost worse sometimes because you don't look like you're fat, and so you don't think you have a problem. There are 60 million Americans in the United States that that are pre-diabetic and don't know it. These are probably your people. Your health may not yet evidence bodily neglect either. You might not be breaking down around yourself. You might not be overweight, but it may come years down the road. But what you look like in the mirror is not necessarily evidence of good stewardship. Just look at the people using gear, aka steroids. And maybe they're just starting and they don't look like a genetic freak yet. And all of a sudden you're like, yeah, they look pretty good. Are they healthy? By injecting exogenous, chemically altered hormones into their body? No. So the mirror isn't good evidence that you're doing the right thing with your body. It usually is, but it's not for sure. Now, I'm not suggesting anyone is a glutton if they don't eat perfect. That's not what I'm talking about. So if you eat a little bit of dessert here and there, you have a cocktail or whatever, I don't know what your theological perspective is on alcohol. My typical recommendation is to not drink it. Alcohol is not good for you in any way, shape, or form. There are some that are worse for you than others. I'm not suggesting that if anyone is a glutton or a drunkard, if they don't eat or drink perfect, not at all. What I am suggesting is that we look carefully at our lives and assess where the hidden idols are in our lives. They probably can hide in your waistline. Apostle Paul says in 1 Timothy 4:16, watch your life and your doctrine closely.